Good evening, everyone. My name is Kenneth Soren Wong Street Channel. I work in the research department here, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Massachusetts Historical Society and to the presentation of the 2019 Peter J. Gomes Memorial Book Prize. The Society established the Peter J. Gomes Memorial Prize 5 years ago in honor of the late Reverend Professor Peter J. Gomes, who was the Plummer Professor of Christian Morals as well as the Pusey Minister of the Memorial Church at Harvard University. He was also an elected member, an overseer, a fellow, and a board member of the Historical Society. A zealous preacher, an orator, a lover of history, he often quoted the book of Romans and urged people to, quote, be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Sound historical scholarship written for a broad audience helps both transform and renew one's mind. In that spirit, and in the memory of Reverend Gomes, who passed away in 2011, the MHS presents this award for the best nonfiction work in the history of Massachusetts, published in the preceding year. This year's competition included 15 works that covered race, political, urban, and environmental history topics. The works covered hundreds of years of history from the colonial period to the 20th century. The selection committee of outside judges included scholars from the field of English, biography, and history from across the country. And the committee selected as the winner of this year's Peter J. Gomes Memorial Book Prize, Christine DeLucia's Memory Lands, King Philip's War, and the Place of Violence in the Northeast, published by Yale University Press in 2018. So now, the president of the Massachusetts Historical Society, Dr. Catherine Allgore.
Thank you so much, Kid. It is my honor and a real privilege to be presenting this year's Peter James Gomes Memorial Prize to Christine DeLucia's Memory Lands, King Philip's War, and the Place of Violence in the Northeast. Memory Lands illustrates how memory has shaped the writing of history and vice versa in such intricate ways that by the early 21st century, memory and history are thoroughly entwined. Memory Lands takes memories and, quote, explores their origins, transformations, and cultural functions within and beyond their home communities. In addition, this work makes a substantial contribution to a larger historical conversation, one that we like around here to have, about, quote, how we know what we know about early American pasts, investigating the sources and sites that inform scholars and everyday people about that past. In her examination of what she says, how repositories originated, how collections developed, and the process of deciding what belongs inside and what doesn't, Christine DeLucia points out that, quote, Puritan and Yankee archivists used control of paper trails to bolster real-world hegemony. By developing a critical genealogically of archiving, this study demonstrates that the very sources upon which scholars rely to reconstruct Northeastern pasts have been infected by historical contingencies and settler colonialism. Papers and artifacts destroyed intentionally and accidentally. Curators who decided not to collect or to deaccession certain materials, the alienation of tribal communities from their own heritage objects claimed and controlled by outside repositories. Indeed, DeLucia even implicates the former officers of the Massachusetts Historical Society for their disrespectful treatment of Native American objects like the burial bowl supposedly taken from King Philip's wigwam after his death. Such reminders are important for both scholars and activists to carefully consider in their daily duties as they categorize and hold irreplaceable objects from the past. There's another connection, I think, with the Massachusetts Historical Society. DeLucia also draws inspiration from the Society's principal founder, Jeremy Belknap, who recommended that a researcher immerse oneself in the environment they are studying. In that spirit, while writing the book, DeLucia intrepidly journeyed far and wide, from archives to wildernesses across treacherous terrain, to live up to her belief that, quote, fieldwork ought to be an integral part of researching place and memory. Reverend Belknap would have been proud. The product of her endeavors is the clear-cut winner of this year's Gomes Prize. The selection committee declared Memory Lands, quote, a major intervention in scholarship on 17th century New England, and praises DeLucia for showing, quote, the many ways that the violence of this conflict is present today in the elision of Native spaces and experiences from sites of commemoration. The committee concluded that Memorylands, quote, joins the work of decolonizing the narrative surrounding the white settlement of indigenous lands, and unanimously agreed on the recipient of the prize. For the scope of her imagination, the scale of her work, the miles she has traveled, the hidden vistas she has taught us all to see, and for the lessons she imparts on us in this masterful study, it is my honor to present the 2019 Peter J. Gomes Memorial Prize to Dr. Christine DeLucia.
Dr. DeLucia, I'm going to put this back here so everyone can marvel and envy.
So I will keep my own remarks very brief because I'm really looking forward to the conversation with Rae Gould in a moment. But what I would like to emphasize first and foremost is that we are in a native place that continues to be Native American homelands. My book is about the ongoing histories of Native places in the Northeast. And so in that spirit, before I say anything else, I would like to acknowledge that these are the traditional and ongoing homelands of Massachusetts people, very near Nipmuc, Wampanoag, and many other Native homelands. And hopefully Rae and I can talk more about what that means today. I also wanted to stress that this book came out of many years of connections. It comes out of human relationships. And without simply reading a list of names, I wanted to give you a little flavor of what that has meant for doing this work, which in so many ways is not the isolated work of a scholar sitting in an archive, but rather someone out in the world learning from others. So if I may, very briefly here, acknowledge 4 people who are in the audience today that give you a sense of how this work has proceeded, what it means to be doing history in an engaged manner. Cheryl Tony Hawley, Chief of the Nipmuc Nation, is with us today, leader of a sovereign Native community that has endured through generations in the Northeast, and whose own work on history and genealogy has profoundly inflected the ways that I think. And I know that I'm just at the beginning of the learning process of what it means to remember and to engage with these places. So thank you for all that you have done. I would also like to point out Liz Cohen, but Elizabeth Cohen, who is here tonight, was my professor in college when I was an undergraduate student, and I was just embarking on this work. And I remember vividly a class with her on the built environment of Boston, in which she took us on a seemingly endless but rewarding walking tour of downtown Boston to show us how place itself is a way of knowing, and how to understand the buildings, the streets, the lands around us. Had I not taken that class, I don't know if I would have been quite on this path. I would also like to recognize Steve Silliman. I think Steve is over there, an archaeologist. So I am a historian by way of training, meaning I work a lot with documents, but one of the most magnificent journeys that I have been on is learning how other people think about the past, whether it's through oral histories, through objects, through the land itself. And I am grateful to people like Steve Silliman for inviting me out to archaeological sites, in this case, the Eastern Pequot's home sites, and helping me think about objects and place. And one more thank you. My father is here today, Mike DeLucia, and I would very much like to thank my own family, who has lived in different parts of New England for many years and been with me on this learning process. I am not a Native community member myself, and it has been eye-opening, to say the very least, to begin delving further into the histories of a region that I thought I knew, and it turned out the stories are very different. And I thank my family for helping me on that process. The other place that I wanted to touch down on before we have this conversation is I was recently thinking about bookshelves, and I know we're in a library, so this is appropriate, and what a strange circumstance it is that because of alphabetical order, you wind up sharing shelf space with people. In my case, it is the D section. And I've spent some time thinking in bookstores and libraries about who you live next to because of your last name. And two scholars who I wanted to mention, just to point at these bigger conversations that I am part of. I am grateful to be shelf neighbors with Phil DeLucia, who is a native historian recently arrived at Harvard, whose books Playing Indian and Indians in Unexpected Places have really helped me grapple with indigenous people and modernity. And he is my neighbor. And also, from a very different vantage, John Demos, the early American historian who has written about Deerfield, captivity, and so many other histories, a very different approach to history than in Native studies, but has also been influential in how I conceptualize these paths. And I do this to say simply that none of this work is done in isolation, and that I feel exceptionally fortunate to be working alongside and as part of these conversations that are so rich and so difficult, as Rae and I will get into. So thank you very much for that. I am deeply appreciative of this award. Thanks.
And I'll just make a quick reminder that there are also books for sale in the lobby after the conclusion of the program, and I'm sure Professor DeLucia would be happy to sign them. Christine DeLucia is an assistant professor of history at Williams College. She earned her bachelor's degree from Harvard College and her doctorate from Yale University. She has published numerous essays in many scholarly journals, among them the William and Quarterly Mary, the New England Quarterly, the Journal of, and also the Journal of American History. Her work has been supported by numerous fellowships and institutions, including the Newberry Library, the American Antiquarian Society, the Organization of American Historians, the American Historical Association, and the Massachusetts Historical Society. Memory Lands is her first book. Dr. Rae Gould is the inaugural Associate Director of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Initiative at Brown University. She earned her bachelor's degree from Connecticut College and her doctorate in anthropology and archaeology from the University of Connecticut. She previously served as a senior lecturer in anthropology and director of the certificate program in Native American and Indigenous Studies, as well as the tribal liaison at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She has also taught courses in archaeology, cultural heritage, and Native American and Indigenous Studies at Catholic University, American University, and Connecticut College. She is a member of the Nipmuc Nation of Massachusetts. Ladies and gentlemen, Drs. DeLucia and Gould.
Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for being here. It is really, really an honor. Do you all hear me okay? I'm putting my teacher voice out there. So my understanding is we have 20 to 25 minutes to discuss 360 pages of history, right? Amazing history that was explored by Christine in such incredibly innovative ways, I felt, when I read this book for the first time. And thank you to Botany for doing this work, for being here, and for inviting me. I'm really, really honored to be part of this event this evening. I feel like I'm an anthropologist by trade, and when I have taught intro classes before, I've thought about the cogs in the wheel, right? How everything is interrelated when we think about culture and history and this holistic nature of who we are as human beings. So I'm just a cog in the wheel in all of this. I thought a natural place to start with this would be the title of the book. Memory Lands, King Philip's War and the Place of Violence in the Northeast. And really wanted to have a grounding and thinking about what this would be. In many ways, the book is a journey. I, myself, when reading it, it almost felt like a novel. Like I could visualize these places. I actually had been to a lot of these places and I knew them because I'm local native. But it's a journey of places, histories, objects, and many, many stories. You are an amazing, amazing storyteller. I have to say that. I was revisiting this on the train from Providence up here this afternoon, and just really getting lost in it once again. So I'm really interested in starting by knowing how you came up with this title, right? Where did Memorylands come from? And just kind of hoping that we can start with that this evening.
Sure. And maybe before answering that, I want to say to people what a pleasure this is to be in conversation with Rae. This feels very formal. Our
I know.
conversations are usually in other kinds of settings. And really the only way that I would want to talk about this work is in conversation, because that is the nature of this project, right? It comes out of these kinds of interactions. The title went through many variations, and what I really wanted to stress is that this place where we are in the Northeast is deeply infused with memory, that it has incredible layers of meaning for different communities. And some of them may be obvious in the signs that are out on the land, but many others of those memories are accessible via other means. They might be stories that are very closely held by families. They might be stories that linger in archives and can now be brought to the surface a little bit more. And I very much wanted readers of this book to have a sense of place. We often talk colloquially about a sense of place, but what does that really mean when we get into histories that are deeply emotional and often deeply violent and painful? What forms does memory take in particular places? It turns out that Western Massachusetts along the Connecticut River has a very different constellation of meaningful places than, say, Bermuda, which I talk about in the last part of the book. So that is some of the hope with the title.
Yeah, and I really love the way you go back and forth between contemporary English names and indigenous names for places. So that was really, I think, again, a very innovative approach that you used, which was important and really makes the reader stop and think about this place and this landscape. So that actually relates to the next thing that I wanted to talk about, which is this concept of homelands. If you're not Native, you might not automatically wake up and think about this landscape that we're in as a homeland. But for Native people, this is how we have conceived of this place of southern New England for many generations, and you really dive into that in such a successful way. So you move between past and present really, really well. You go to places like Deer Island, and you understand the history and the context to the war. But then you also go there in the contemporary period. I think 2014 was your first time there. And you understand the impacts on present-day Native people of the region of these places and this concept of homelands. Your book is also place-based, right? So this is a history of something that happened in the 1670s, but it's not chronological. And I absolutely loved that about your book. And it dives into pieces of American and tribal histories. So going between past and present, tribal history, American history, and understanding how they're all really interwoven. That was a really, really powerful component of this book, I felt. It was also accessible and engaging. So this sounds a bit like a promotion for your book, but it's everything that I felt. I was like, how do I encapsulate everything that I felt and that I experienced when I read this book? So let's get back to this concept of homelands that is so central to both the book, I felt, and Native New England people, because it is a key concept and it's interwoven throughout the book. When did you first begin thinking about this area? So you went to Yale and stuff, and you can explore that if you want, but kind of knowing each other and knowing that history, I'm really curious, and I think it would be really helpful for the audience to understand when you first began thinking of this area as a homeland and how that happened.
Yeah, so this has been something that has really taken years to sink in with me, that Native communities have been here for thousands and thousands of years. It is a depth of time that far exceeds European immigrant histories in this area. And I knew this growing up in Manchester, New Hampshire, but I didn't really know this. I didn't know what it meant to say Native people have been at this particular place around the waterfalls for at least 8,000 years. Right? What does 8,000 years, probably much longer than that, actually mean? And it's a depth of connection to place and an ongoing connection to place. I think we talk about this a lot, that in New England there is this pretty entrenched narrative that Native people used to be here and were deeply formative to this region, but are now gone. And a major part of the book, as in if you take nothing else away from the book, is that Native communities and sovereign nations are still here and are still deeply engaged in and exercising autonomy over their own homelands. And part of it, in terms of how this concept came in, is recognizing that Boston has not always been Boston. It has been Shamet, it has been Mishawum, right? And so getting into place names to reconceptualize what the often much, much longer term Native communities and networks in this region were, and then thinking very carefully about what happens when colonization begins to arrive in this region, the ways that it transforms, but actually does not displace Native communities.
We are indeed still here. Thank you. I want to have a little aside here because we're in the hotel that we're staying in earlier, and there's a hotel bar attached to the lobby, and it starts in 1492. And then it comes through, I think,
1630.
Yeah, it's like,
Yeah.
wait a minute here. And I just looked at her, I'm like, it's right there. Yeah,
Mhm.
it's 1492. So this idea of homelands and place and landscape and everything that you explore in words in your book actually is really connected to the next thing I was thinking about was how you, on the ground, you physically explored these places. You traveled, you got to know people in place in very, very intimate ways by visiting them and spending time with them and getting to know them. And that's where these stories came that Christine is so amazingly gifted at telling. So you wrote the book by exploring peoples and places and kind of, again, moving between the past and the present. Many of these places, anyone in this room could visit, right? You could find these places by going to her book and then saying, it's the Great Swamp Massacre site and going there. And for me, part of this visualization came from certain quotes that you had. So I wanted to share one. This one I found on page 16. And Christine wrote these words, and it just they really stopped me in my tracks. She wrote, "Envision that, a vast memorial terrain dotted with holes in the earth, continuously being cleared, refreshed, and narrated by those who walked, powerfully linked together ancestors and their descendants." That really spoke to me because, here I was, a descendant of these people who had dotted this terrain and had all of these experiences over it. So I'm wondering if you can share some of your experiences of these explorations. For example, I know that you went to the first time you went to the Deer Island paddle and what that was like, and specifically how you were received and how you reached out to people in very specific, and I think what we see from the information in your book is it must have been very appropriate ways. So if you could share that knowledge with people.
Yeah. So the book begins with Deer Island, actually, this site of incarceration of Native people during King Philip's War, ostensibly for their own protection, but caused the deaths of likely hundreds of Native people. So a site of great trauma in Boston Harbor. The very first time I went there, I took an MBTA bus, and it was all by myself, and learned nothing about this because there's no monument on the site. There's nothing that would speak that history to you. The next time I went there, as you were noting, was in the company of a variety of Native community members from Nipmuc, Wampanoag, Wabanaki, who were engaged in the Deer Island Memorial, which is a canoe and also walking, running journey to retrace this route and to commemorate the Native ancestors who were removed there. And it was an utterly different experience of Deer Island, standing there, hearing stories from community members, families who have long known about these histories and are bearing witness with these testimonies that are extraordinarily compelling, difficult, important to share. And it was like night and day for me to hear the difference of this engaged conversation in that place, not much of which may show up in a textual archive, but is nonetheless very fully, powerfully present on the land. The other thing I'll say about that early set of participation in the Deer Island Memorial, and this says something about my own naivete probably as a graduate student, I had intended to stand on shore on the Charles River and watch as the canoes, as part of this journey, went by. And very quickly, people said, "Get in the canoe. We need to paddle the canoe." It's okay, and that was a moment of transformation for me. I think I didn't realize at the time, but what does it mean to be on shore witnessing versus in the canoe as an ally, not as a native community member, but as someone who supports and bears witness to this work. And also, in that first time, I think I'll mention, I was the only one who may have been silly enough to bring a digital camera in a canoe in winter or in very cold weather. And so I wound up documenting a certain amount of that memorial and then sharing pictures with people. But that is something that has sat with me in a quite strong way, in the canoe on the shore, without ever wanting to intrude in a space that sometimes is very much for communities on their own terms. Seeing the value in places where it's appropriate of sharing these histories more broadly. And if some think that blurs the line between scholarship and activism, I would say scholarship is always engaged in ways that are related to advocacy and to trying to bring about a different kind of future. And I'm willing to embrace that.
Excellent. I think I recalled too that you and I had started to develop a relationship. And before going to the paddle, you reached out to me and asked if it was appropriate to go. And then I put you in touch with people and
And I mean, this is all about, we're talking about networks here, and these are networks of relationships that are within communities. They are also connected to archives, to scholars. There's this, in my head right now, there are like 1,000 people that I'm thinking of who have contributed to the shaping of these histories. And in that respect, it's very strange to have a book with one author's name on it, because the book is about this collective process, right? And about the fact that communities have long been participating in retrieving and carrying forward and honoring these very challenging histories.
Right, and that we're reaching back generations for this sharing. We cannot talk about Memory Lands without discussing the topic of colonialism and settler colonialism in particular, which you're very, very clear about, and I thank you again for that. So the event that is focused on in the book, which is King Philip's War, was clearly an event situated in a colonial context, so in a time period that we understand to happen in the 1670s. But it also discusses, at the same time, placemaking, memorialization, and how history and memory making have indelible and long-lasting influences on the perceptions of Native people that exist into the present. And that is, again, one of the powerful strengths of this book. So also, it's very clear that these are foundational concepts, like what happened here in New England, this whole Thanksgiving holiday that we celebrate on an annual basis, right? These are foundational connections to American history making that we revisit over and over and over again. I feel that this book is also powerful because it broadens readers' understandings of what it means to discuss colonial context, right? We start to think about it in very new ways when we explore this book. So I'm hoping, and that this context still exists, right? Whenever I'm in a situation and we start talking about a colonial context, I am always probably the first person to remind people that many of us still feel we are very much in a colonial context still in the year 2020, as we begin to think about Plymouth 400, right? So I'm hoping you can share with us your thoughts on why the histories you include in the book are important, right? There's many histories that you tell here. To the overall topic of American history making. So we're getting out of our Southern New England bubble here, and the importance of this colonial context.
So this may be one of the biggest questions here, right? To conceive of the United States as an ongoing colonial project, meaning dispossessive of Native people, and that is a condition that is still happening today. To be able to theorize that and talk about that in very careful, historically specific ways is one of the projects of this book. And I think one of the most difficult points for readers who may not have encountered these topics before. What does it mean for the US to be colonial today? and for land to still be claimed in certain ways, and Native communities still fighting to exercise sovereignty, right? These are big, big topics. And I hope that one of the interventions of this book is to give readers some firmer grasp of what that looks like in New England, with the understanding that this is happening across the continent, and that this has a ripple effect from New England all the way to the Pacific, right? This is a regional case study, but it has these bigger contours to it. And it is a history that often, when talked about in this way, generates some form of resistance or backlash. And I think I just want to name that here, because that is the ongoing challenge of doing this work. That if I simply say the United States is colonial, and everyone nodded and moved on, it would mean that people didn't really understand the magnitude of that claim. And attendant to that, what it means to engage in decolonization, which, as you have noted, is one of the methodologies of this book, and also comes back to land all the time. The fact that the city of Boston, to take just one example, is still very much colonized space. And one of the reasons I write about the Deer Island canoe paddle is because it has us thinking in these other ways about conceptualizing space, that actually this is still very much native space. Even though the land is claimed in these ways, it can have both those dimensions to it, and certainly stresses the way the communities themselves have been trying to push back against a form of colonialism that attempts to erase their very own existence.
It's a constant fight, I can tell you that. So that flows into the idea of the importance of place, right? You're talking about Boston, you're talking about very specific places. And I mentioned before that there's this journey, right? And I really felt like readers are able to travel with Christine through these 360 pages, and they kind of create, I hope, their own memories over time, space, and generations. I feel like you really captured those well in your conversations, in the memories that you make about these very specific places, and how there's this very interwoven nature of our collective past, which was referenced earlier. I have this quote from page 15. I'm not sure which part of it is the quote, but you focus on the materiality of remembrance and the transformation of landscapes. So this materiality aspect, right, which we think about when we're in a place like this, right, where there's artifacts or there's documents, very real things that we can touch. They're very, very real. And I'm hoping you can share with us, to the extent that you can, because you visited many places, of the places that you visited and reflected on for this book, do one or two stand out as especially important or significant in their presence on the landscape and how they really influenced your thinking and your writing of this book?
Sure. Well, since we've been talking about Deer Island in different ways, has anyone ever been to Deer Island, I should ask? Some? Yes, a larger number than we had thought. So Deer Island itself, if you've been there, has been almost completely remade since the 17th century. It has drumlins, hills. There's now a wastewater treatment plant on it, which I talk about a lot in the book. And that sewage treatment plant is a physical sign, right? A material signature on the land of how certain histories and experiences have been valued and others have not been in that way. That sewage treatment plant got built, as you know, despite the protests of many tribal communities, saying that these are intensely sensitive grounds where our ancestors died, and we do not find it appropriate to have this sewage plant built on it. The existence of that plant tells us something, right? That is evidence. But to maybe take a little bit of a different tack, thinking about Western Massachusetts, where we spend a lot of time, along the Connecticut River, there is this beautiful waterfalls at the place sometimes called Peskeomskud or Wissatinawag. It's a giant waterfall where Native communities from many different tribal contexts had been gathering for at least 8,000 years, probably longer than that, to fish, to socialize, to enact diplomacy. And this becomes a site at which they are targeted during King Philip's War, and there's a horrific massacre that happens there. Today, if you go out to that waterfalls, you will see so many ways that the land has changed and actually concealed that history. The river itself is dammed, meaning that people cannot fish there in the ways that they customarily would have. The river is stopped, even though there are sort of fish passageways. There is an airport nearby that I write about, and there have been proposals to expand the runways of the Turners Falls Airport. And Native communities, including Wampanoag and Nipmuc, may have been involved in this, saying this is a sensitive ceremonial landscape. And the very project of development is going to come at the expense of these sensitive, sacred homelands landscapes. So what to do about that, right, when progress is running up against some deeply meaningful kinds of place caretaking? One of the goals of this book is to give people an ability to go to places like this and understand the landscape as itself a creation of these contested histories, rather than to just see a dam and an airport, to understand how those have come into being and to realize that the future can be different in these places.
And I think we can't talk about a different future without talking about a decolonized future, which is very much one of the points that I wanted to make sure to touch upon this evening. This book, to me, offers a clear invitation to colonize both our understandings. Decolonize.
There we go, there we go.
It's late, and I was up watching the Super Bowl last night. I will let you know that. To decolonize both our understandings and our future tellings of the past, right? So how we situate our understandings now, and then as we move forward, either as scholars or everyday people, right, thinking about history, and explore what decolonization looks like and why it's so important. So there's this brief excerpt from the book that I want to share, which really, again, kind of made me stop. And the example is histories of violence and colonialism, exquisite pleasures, right? Exquisite pleasures. And this really forced discomfort for me, and I think for many readers to stop and think about this. You were talking about an 1897 Boston exhibit with texts from King Philip's War. So here we are, 200 and something years later, and these texts shimmered as elegant objects for leisurely delight. Right, we're remembering violence as in a sense of voyeurism, making their material surfaces the prime attractions without consideration for the troubling contents within. And I found that on page 83. So I really loved the fact that your book was discomforting, and I'm hoping, and I thought it was very purposeful. I'm hoping that you can share your thoughts on that and this discomfort element.
If it has been discomforting, then that is a goal achieved here. And at various points I have been uneasy about that project, but I think history needs to push people in various ways. The books that I was talking about, I think this is an apt place to say, were these antiquarian book collectors who were often rebinding 17th century histories of violence, filled with the most horrifying details of 17th century warfare and displacement of Native peoples, binding them into these beautiful gilded, leather-bound, finely tooled covers. And there can be a way, I think, that scholars sometimes get so fascinated by the object itself, this book, that they're not thinking about the contexts and the content of those that are incredibly disturbing. It's the surface that kind of gains the attention. To your bigger question here, in terms of what a decolonizing methodology might look like, my first reaction to that is to ask Native communities what their own priorities are, what their own hopes are, what their own goals around objects, land, stories are, and to go from there. And as part of that, to say something that may not be the most au courant for scholars, which is to slow down, to pursue this work at a much slower pace, because as we were saying at the outset, decolonizing relationships involve building connections with people, building trust, building a sense of why a project is being pursued, and maybe changing that project, as you certainly have encountered in your own work. And I think that there could be a pressure sometimes in academic history writing to churn out books very quickly without taking the time to pause and to be responsive to community's own needs and desires and values, and also to really sit with some of the materials in these archives. I have sat in this room doing research on a number of occasions, and I should say, at times I thought the library staff might have believed that I was just spacing out, but I was not spacing out. I was thinking, what does this sentence actually mean? How might this take us into a different understanding? And I have an immediate thought, but then if I let this sit with me for often a very long time, I may come around to this in a different way. Or maybe I will share this document that I have encountered with someone from a community, and it turns out that they already know this document and have actually done a lot of research on this. Building in time for that process is what I think is required as at least one component of a decolonizing process. And also recognizing that this work is always multivocal, meaning that it is never just one person claiming authority over these stories, but rather doing the work to bring forward, in ways that are appropriate, other understandings. And so my hope is that my book is not going to be the final word on any of this. That would be exactly the opposite of the point. But rather that down the road, others will create their own books or digital tools or walking tours that may surface very other understandings, and nothing could make me more happy than to see someone 20 years from now have a different kind of response to this book.
Excellent. I know we want to have lots of time for questions from the audience. So I have one more quick question to kind of wrap up our component here. If you had one or two pieces of advice, so this is kind of about how to tell history, which speaks exactly to what you were talking about, and engage with history and also ourselves, right? So this component of what I call self-reflexivity that needs to happen, which you have clearly done so successfully in writing this and how you, everything that you did to get to that point. If you had one or two pieces of advice for developing historians or even people just interested in history, or this time period, how would you suggest they practice this process of what you call reopening history and critical self-reflexivity in either their own work as historians, if they're doing that in a formal sense, or maybe in their everyday lives, how they think about things and places and memory and history making?
So that phrase, reopening history, I want to credit to Doug Harris, who does tribal historic preservation work with the Narragansett tribe. And he was speaking about a battlefields investigation project at Nipsachuk in northern Rhode Island, a very multi-community place that was involved during these violences, and today has been a site of many collaborative reinvestigations. And that phrase really sat with me when he talked about reopening history, that the story is not done, and to your larger point here, that we ought to always be suspicious when we think that we know the answer to something, or that, of course, this is really the narrative. And here I would like to credit many of my own students, both at Mount Holyoke and at Williams College, who question everything. Sometimes it's a bit much, but most of the time it has been very generative for me, that things I have assumed, either as factual or as interpretive sort of statements, they often say, but is that the case? Or why is that monument there? Why is that place name there? Why does the library at Williams College have a copy of a native language Bible? Why is it here? And as a teacher, those questions often force me to slow down a lot and to realize that there are very other ways of conceptualizing this work of heritage or of doing history. And I think that that is widely applicable advice, to question everything, and to also be careful about that, to realize that there are some areas where it is appropriate for me as a non-native scholar to ask a lot of questions, and that there are some places where that is not the best course of action, and to know when one is the other, right? And how to move forward in a way that is critically minded, but also responsible and responsive. So that is where I will leave people on that count.
Excellent, thank you so much. I guess at this point,
questions.
yes.
Thank you.
We will open it up. So the instruction was, if you have a question.
Sorry. That was very interesting. What I was curious about is you had mentioned on a couple of occasions histories going back 8,000 years, I believe. We're in a library that has millions of documents, and I was curious as to what sources. Is it archaeological? Is it word of mouth, oral history? Where are you drawing upon for the pre-Columbian factual histories of what occurred in these areas?
Well, I'm actually trained as an archaeologist. I don't admit that very often. And I had to get the blessing of our Sunsquat to do that, which was a self-learning process myself. So there's a lot of archaeological evidence, basically post-glacial. So the ice was a mile deep here, around 10 to 12,000 years ago. I think more like 12, and then it started to recede. We have another archaeologist in the room who also might be able to speak to this. So the archaeological record speaks of that, and indigenous knowledge also speaks of that. So it's a combination, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, you've asked a question that gets at the heart of what an interdisciplinary methodology ought to mean, which is that is not ever just one kind of source or voice in isolation. And in this count, I would mention that many native oral traditions from this area have phrasing like "since time out of mind" or "since time immemorial," or you could think of other phrasing here, which basically mean from a very, very long time ago, and that there's an incredible continuity to those traditions that have to do with where people have been, their relationships to certain places. I'm thinking of like the Mosh-up stories in Wampanoag and related communities that talk about how the coastline was formed, how the hills came to be, why this island is this way. And those are forms of knowledge that have continued over so many generations that take us back way before, as you mentioned, that the hotel bar we were seeing that starts in 1492, right? These are taking us way before Columbus as a sort of dividing point, and asking us to reckon with what that incredible span of human history, if this is, then colonization happens kind of here. But what I like about your question too is that it has us carefully situating written sources, right? That Native communities have long been communicating and expressing themselves in all kinds of ways, material, oral, place-based, but writing in terms of a quill on a piece of parchment is a relatively recent arrival. And we need to always be thinking about archives like that in relation to the much, much longer set of experiences that people have had in these places.
It's a long record.
Thank you for that.
Thank you for this wonderful conversation and the work that you've both done. I'm wondering, Christine, if there were to be a next place that you would take up and write about, not that that's necessarily what you're doing, or if you could tell us, you mentioned the Turner's Falls issue, are there some other places we should be attending to? And I know there's also, I think the issue of the state seal has come up. That's a very live issue. I don't know if you want to go there.
No, let's go there. Let's go there. That's what this is all about.
We're learning a lot from you, and I'm grateful.
Thank you for that. Wow, so many places. There are a lot of ways in which Massachusetts, New England, the United States is in the midst of a really challenging and important set of conversations about what to do with history and what to do with this symbolic vocabulary that has been inherited, that is here in so many ways. Many of us today probably passed a Massachusetts state flag somewhere, right, that has this seal that actually comes from the 17th century. It's been adapted, but showing a Native person in very caricatured form, right? Why is that here? And what is at stake in opening up the possibilities for a different representation, particularly around mascots? That's an adjacent conversation. When Native communities have often made it very clear that they do not find themselves respected by Indian mascots. But to give you a sense of some of the magnitude of that, one of the central places in this book, The Waterfall by Pesquiamscut, right, where hundreds of Native people lost their lives in a massacre, the mascot of the town high school athletic teams has been the Indians for a long time, and there has been pushback against that, and there has also been counter pushback, if you can imagine that, with a number of people feeling very invested in keeping that symbol. despite now having heard a different understanding of its meanings. And so that is where some of this challenge is today. I think we talk about this a lot, that a lot of change has happened in terms of how people conceptualize indigenous and colonial relationships, but there is a lot that remains to be done. And to the extent that a book like this might be able to give people some constructive basis for understanding that and reflecting on that, I hope that it is able to do a little bit of that. If I might say, in answer to the question as well, my second project is moving very much into the 18th century, in part because I became frustrated at how many New England histories make it seem as if Native people are gone at the end of King Philip's War. Or if they are remaining, it's in, all of this is in quotes, sort of enclaves, marginal communities, sort of on the outskirts of what else is happening. And that is not the case. And so looking for ways to recenter those continuing Native communities who have managed to survive this era of just extraordinary upheaval, who have returned to their home places, who have remade their families and their communities, and who are increasingly in intimate kinds of relationships with people of European descent and also people of African American descent, right? So that is where the second project is going, to say the American Revolution is not happening in an indigenous vacuum. It's actually coming out of these ongoing histories.
Memory and memorials. I lived, both my children were born in Turner's Falls, and across the Connecticut River, there was tradition that was one of the council meetings of King Philip. Down the river, there is Deerfield. So the question of memory lands and memory towns becomes open to really question, how do we begin to reapproach the sort of antique historiography that created Deerfield, where there are people there that lived and died all throughout the King Philip's War and aftermaths later on. So how do we address memory lands and memory towns?
I had the interesting experience in the fall of having a student in one of my history classes at Williams who had attended Deerfield Academy, which is right in the middle of all of this Native colonial space that is so active, and had not really learned about any of this history, despite spending all of those years living in the middle of it, right? So we had this really rich conversation about what it takes to activate those histories. Just because they're known in certain places doesn't mean it's connecting, particularly with K through 12 education. And this is something I always like to mention, that there's a lot more room to bring this work into the curriculum. In so many ways, by the time we get students in college classrooms, there have already been a lot of expectations, narratives that people think they know, that are instilled early on. At the same time, I would also like to credit educators who in those early places make an effort to make sure that their students are aware of these other histories, especially where they live today. If I might say something else about Deerfield, I recently learned that the Massachusetts Department of Transportation in certain parts of Massachusetts has been funding a refurbishment of these tercentenary signs. Has anyone ever seen these? They're these sort of black and white big signs that tell things about a town's history, often landmarks. And I got very excited because I thought, oh, they're redoing the signs. I've written about these signs. I've written about how problematic they can be in the stories they choose to tell or don't tell, and then learned that they were simply repainting them. They were just refinishing them. And it was this moment of, if I'm being honest, like, oh, no one read the article I wrote, where I have this extended sort of critical context of these signs. But it has me thinking about how to carry those interventions out into a more public space. And in fact, I know one of those signs is right on the edge of Hassanamisco.
Yes,
You guys have one of those right there,
It is,
right?
we do. So
And you know the sign very well, right? And I don't think that the pieces are always connecting in terms of making sure that these stories are carried forward in the ways they ought to. But we're working on it. There are so many projects that are ongoing to try to do this work.
Yes, and I have to say there have been several attempted interventions with Historic Deerfield. I taught a class at UMass actually I think it was just like a year or so ago, And that was one of the things that we broached with them, was like how to truly decolonize that place, how to rethink those monuments and those signs.
Yeah,
So I
and
think-
if I might, before another question, this is really one of those places where partnerships are essential, whether it's local historical societies, tribal communities, K through 12 educators, that none of us can do this work alone. And there's so much knowledge and goodwill often on the ground that we would be happy to talk with people who might be interested about that.
I think we have time for one more question, so it's you.
I just want to share research and then a question, because you
Sure.
brought up the whole around the seal of Massachusetts. There are 5 bills that are pending at the State House, and I wanted to give a resource for people to write down if you're interested in
Thank you. Thank
supporting the agenda of the Native American community. It's maindigenousagenda.org, and they just did a call for people to reach out to legislators, because everything has to be reported out of committee by the 5th of February. So I hope people will write this down, maindigenousagenda.org. And then my question is, have you been approached or been by this group that it's a really great community of folks who have come together to help this agenda go forward? Because certainly your research and what you do to speak to legislators, you did speak up the State House Library about your book. If there's been ways to think about how this important scholarly work that both of you do can help activate the people who make the laws to help understand that they need to make laws for everybody and what that looks like. So that's my question to you.
Really good question.
I love the question, and I will say that the book is published. It now exists in physical form, but I'm thinking about ways and working on ways actually at the moment about digitally translating some of this to be more accessible to, say, as you were noting, a legislator, an educator, someone who may not have the time or the bandwidth to engage a full work of scholarship like this, but might want to know what is the take-home message on this, or what does this have to say about, say, this issue of representation today. And in that spirit, I should have mentioned her earlier, our dear friend and colleague Lisa Brooks, whose book, Our Beloved Kin, about King Philip's War, came out in 2018 and won the Bancroft Prize this year. She has developed a companion website to that book called Our Beloved Kin. If you Google that, that gives a lot of these kinds of public-facing resources for people who want to know more. And there are more of these digital projects in the works, because I think we see the need to have scholarship be accessible and moving and responsive to issues like this. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.